Hello all. This is the third lecture of the second quarter, and what we'll discuss now is Home Affairs, the short story by Sarah Lotz. This is a picture of Sarah Lotz. She is a South African writer born in the UK but has lived in Cape Town for many years now, and she writes a lot of science fiction. So this is kind of her forte. Um, The text that we'll be discussing today, Home Affairs, I think is Afrofuturist. I certainly got it from an anthology that is centered on Afrofuturist literature. But it is not as Afrofuturist, I would say, as some of the other texts in the anthology, or the reading pack that I've given you. It doesn't critique Black identity or investigate the different ways in which blackness can be interrogated or described in the kinds of obvious ways that the other stories do. Um, Stories like Sister Lilith, I think, is quite an explicit example of an Afrofuturist text that interrogates black identity more specifically. This one, Sarah Lotz's Home Affairs, seems to be interested more in identity broadly within an African context, how African politics and bureaucracy can influence identity in very sort of negative ways, and the ways in which people have to work around these kinds of structures and obfuscations that are put in their ways to discover and be sort of compliant, legally compliant in terms of identity, have an identity that is legally binding, having an identity that is recognized by the state. So these are the kinds of questions that she interrogates in her story, which is Afrofuturist, but not as Afrofuturist as the other texts in the reading pack that I've given you. The kinds of questions that she wants to ask are the kinds of questions that have been prevalent in lots and lots of science fiction. I would say much of science fiction, most of it even, are texts that try to interrogate what human identity means within the context of certain kinds of technologies, whether it be new technologies or interrogating what identity means under existing technologies and how new technologies or old technologies can be reconfigured or redefined or thought about differently, and how that impacts on how we define ourselves as humans. So the examples that I've given you here are filmic examples. We've mainly been dealing with textual examples. I've given you, and certainly they speak to each other. Many movies that I've mentioned, and certainly some here have been adapted from short stories or novels. Certainly I, Robot and 2001: A Space Odyssey falls under that category. I'm not quite sure about Eagle Eye. I've also mentioned film in, I think, the first lecture where I discussed Black Panther, but very briefly, where I showed you the still of Wakanda and how Wakanda is built on its own very unique technology, based on its own very unique minerals that are inherent or indigenous to that landscape, that isn't found anywhere else on the planet. With these examples here, they're slightly different in how they interrogate technology. In I, Robot, for the first example there, with a very handsome Will Smith looking very dashing, very serious. This short story that it's based on is from the author Isaac Asimov. I think the story from Isaac Asimov is also called I, Robot. I'm not quite sure. I read it many years ago. And the premise of that story in I, Robot, in fact, the premise of the story in all of these, I, Robot, 2001: A Space Odyssey, and Eagle Eye, can be summed up in sort of this question: can we develop technology sophisticated enough to replicate human thought, human behavior, human intention. And whenever science fiction asks this question, the answer is always no. There's always a pessimistic outcome in all of these texts, and you see that similarly in Sarah Lotz's Home Affairs, where the kinds of technology that has been developed in this world, in Home Affairs and in iRobot in 2001 and Eagle Eye, are technologies that sort of supersede what humans need of their creations. So in both in all three, iRobot 2001 and Eagle Eye, technologies have been developed to such an extent that the inventors of those technologies tried to create algorithms that would replicate what we need for humanity. And what happens, I think, in all three scenarios, certainly in iRobot in 2001, is that the robots that humans come to rely on become so sophisticated and so unwaveringly logical. They have this kind of idea that humans don't know just what is good for them. So the robot makes the decision for the humans, and as a result ends up trying to destroy the humans. So the premise in iRobot, for example, and certainly this is true of the short story that it comes from, is that humans are so destructive and self-destructive, and so destructive towards the planet and their environment that the best outcome for them is to destroy themselves, or for robots to destroy the humans, thereby saving the planet. In 2001: A Space Odyssey, HAL is the robot that the humans, the astronauts, rely on to accomplish their space mission, whatever that is. And similarly, HAL makes decisions for the ship and the crew members that the crew members don't find always agreeable, and a pessimistic outcome in all three of these films ensues from that. So in Sarah Lotz's Home Affairs, this is more of a comedic interpretation of that question. There are certainly funny bits in the story, and I think the humor comes from the repetition that you see throughout the short story. And what that repetition does, we'll get into more specifics about that repetition later on, but what she does is try to create humor from it and try to show how farcical it is to create robots that would replicate human thought, human intentionality, and more specifically also human morality, what we think is right and wrong. Robots don't seem to be sophisticated enough to determine that. So the story is dystopian in nature. This is a term that I explained in the first lecture, what dystopia means as a contrast to utopia. Just to recap very briefly, dystopian fiction is that fiction that creates a world that that assumes that everything has gone wrong. Just to sort of sharpen that definition a little bit, when writers write dystopian fictions, sort of by definition, if you were sort of to interrogate this in a sort of proper academic way, dystopian fiction is only that fiction which demonstrates how certain governments or organizations purposefully and intentionally try to destroy humanity. Whether they think this is for good or bad is sort of left up to individual texts to decide, but certainly from the reader's perspective, what is happening within these worlds is intentional and systematic and purposeful. It's not simply a comet hitting the Earth. That's something you can't really plan for. That's just sort of a unlucky accident that happens. So in dystopian fiction, these worlds that are created by people and are so pervasive that they reach all levels of society, from sort of government organizations to science to the law, etc. So in in Sarah Lotz's Home Affairs, we see the same kind of thing where a government organization like Home Affairs has has turned out to be so destructive for humans that it sort of fits comfortably into that category of dystopian fiction. The other thing that it questions, as well as I've mentioned, is that it questions humanness. And also, to expand on that, it questions the morality and ethics behind creating robots to determine what is good or bad for humans. And we see this in the story countless times, that robots continually make bad decisions for humans. They don't really understand the nuances of humans becoming anxious, humans becoming afraid, humans becoming stressful. And the robots don't really know how to interpret that. All they do is repeat the same thing until they get what is desired for the robot itself. They don't really care about getting the job done. All they care about is satisfying whatever algorithm has been programmed into them. And what we do when we go to Home Affairs is try to get our lives sorted out, try to get our identity sorted out or official documents sorted out so that we can be recognized by the state. And the robot that is in charge of these things in the short story doesn't really see that as the final goal. All it wants is to have boxes ticked. Okay, so all of you know this. Every single one of you has been to one of these buildings. Sorry for the discomfort it is causing in many of you in looking at these very, very familiar images. I'm not quite sure where these are. The URLs I've given you may indicate where these Home Affairs are. For example, the one in the top left is the Durban Home Affairs, and you can see how similar these images are. Even though these are different buildings, they all sort of use the same kind of aesthetic. They're all very drab, they're all very square, and they're all very boring looking. And their purpose, they're sort of built only for their purpose. They're not built to look pretty. Of course, that would cost more. They're not built to be inviting or welcoming. They're built to serve a certain function, which is to legitimize the status, the human status of people entering the Home Affairs, people born in the country, people born outside of the country looking for asylum or resident status, whatever the case is. So these are sort of human processing buildings. And they are, you can see the one in the bottom left with the very harsh lighting. People in all the pictures are standing in rows, trying to get themselves organized. So this is what Home Affairs expects you to do as you approach the building. Become organized, be in lines, and for good reason, I think. Things need to be organized, things need to be streamlined as much as Home Affairs tries to get that right. So it treats everyone in exactly the same way. You are not special, you are not important, and to some extent that also diminishes your humanity when you go in there. Certainly I feel that way whenever I have to make a trip to the Home Affairs. So the title of the story is called Home Affairs, and it's, I think, pretty obvious in some ways what Sarah Lotz is trying to do in calling her story Home Affairs. The very surface level meaning of this is that it takes place at a Home Affairs. The Home Affairs that we're in this particular instance, is the one in Cape Town, the Wynberg Home Affairs in Cape Town, which I've never been to. And she describes it in much the same way as you would see all Home Affairs across the country. So I think this is part of why this text falls into the sort of Afrofuturist spectrum. It takes place within Africa. It takes place within an African country, within an African city, within an African town. And what is sort of at the epicenter of the story is that these robots have been created to weed out corruption, which is a particularly sort of cliched African problem. And what I think she's trying to do is show how the problems of corruption within Home Affairs, particularly in South Africa, are dealt with in a very particular way in this short story, which only sort of perpetuates a different kind of corruption, a corruption of identity, a corruption of humanity, if you want to be corny about it. So this is what the story is about. It's about home affairs, and you can read that as affairs of the home, things that happen within the home. And so this is what she's trying to sort of get at within the scenario that she puts before us. Of course, there's a kind of necessity, a brutal necessity to having the home affairs structured in this way, as I alluded to earlier. In our lives, we have to become organized. The state has to identify us in some way in order to allow us to get certain grants, in order to allow us to get married, in order to allow us to have our deaths processed. All of this needs to be organized in some kind of way, and having to treat everyone as an individual would take up a lot of time and resources and money. And this is the kind of thing that the government doesn't really have. So in order to organize people quickly and efficiently at the detriment of the humanity, we are given things like ID numbers. Different kinds of organizations do this in various ways as well. You are all at WITS, and so you are processed in a certain kind of way. I'm sure all of you have journeyed to Solomon House and found similar kinds of experiences, similar kinds of feelings encountered there that you have at the Home Affairs somewhere in Joburg or somewhere in South Africa or somewhere else in your home country. So this is not unique by any means. This is how humans are processed. You have IDs, you have student numbers, you have passport numbers, and this is how you are identified within the confines of the state. This is how you are processed. This is how you are made to be legal. So I don't want to give the impression that all of this is bad all the time. I think this is, as I said before, a sort of brutal necessity to processing people. But that said, Sarah Lotz and certainly readers of the story won't be interested in that aspect right now. What we're interested in are the negative effects of that kind of processing. We are interested in how people are processed to the detriment of their humanity, to the detriment of their identity, to their uniqueness. Home Affairs, WITS even doesn't really care that you enjoy bike riding. It doesn't really care that you are interested in European art house films. It doesn't really care that you're interested in Kwaito music from the 80s. It doesn't really care about you and your likes and dislikes. All it really wants to interrogate is you, your academic abilities, and sort of process you out of the system as quickly and efficiently as possible. So these are the things that we're interested in. We're interested in how these kinds of organizations, particularly Home Affairs, strips you of your humanity, makes you feel slightly less than human, with the irony being that it's trying to sort of validate you as a human, at least as far as the state is concerned. So what is also evident within the title is that interrogation of the word home. This is a word that you are now very familiar with. From the first quarter, we discussed, so a few weeks ago, we discussed the homecoming. And I think the text, both texts sort of interrogate home in a similar kind of way, in that they try to destabilize what our surface level definition of that term is. So in this case here, we have home, but the kinds of things that we associate with home is the place at which one feels most comfortable, the place in which one feels most oneself. It is a particularly intimate place, the kind of place that is preserved for self-expression, self-definition, self-realization, self-actualization, etc. And what Home Affairs does, and what Sarah Lotz tries to show, is the irony of being called Home Affairs. It is certainly a place where you do not feel at home at all. At least I may be speaking for myself there. It is a place that doesn't feel really welcoming. It is a place that doesn't make you really feel as if you are your own self. It is there just to process you. It is there to give you a number, a pink form. It is there to give you a certain kind of license that tells you can do this and not that. So what she does is sort of um, undermine the terminology that governments use in calling their institutions, um, various institutions around the world, calling it home affairs. There's nothing really homely about home affairs. It doesn't really invite you or welcome you at all. I'd like to get into the this sort of aesthetic choices that Lotz has used to develop our ideas and to interrogate these ideas and show the futility of it, the folly of it, the humor in it, and also the trauma it causes many people within this process. You will notice throughout the story some parts at the beginning and then again later on towards the end where we get a variation of this quotation here where the Conobot is speaking. It sort of, you go up to the Conobot and it begins to engage you in conversation or what it thinks is conversation. And we see this introduction here repeated a few times throughout the story. So this is one of the first times it appears. There's an anxious woman sitting next to the protagonist, Pendy, and the anxious woman gets up and approaches the Conobot and begins to engage with it, trying to get her things sorted out. And this is what the Conobot says. Hello, Goeiemorgen, Sawubona. How are you today, sir? Madam, I'm fine, thank you for asking. The Conobot greets the woman with its rictus grin. In which language will you be communicating with us today? In A, English, B, isiXhosa, C, isiZulu. We're sorry, but these are the only 3 options available today. Please state the letter that corresponds to your language preference in 3, 2, 1 now. So you see that there's repetition here, not within this section, but it is, this piece here is repeated throughout the story. And what is evident within this section itself are the run-on sentences. So, hello, Goeiemorgen, Sawubona. How are you today, sir? Madam, I'm fine. Thank you for asking. That is an example of a run-on sentence where there are no breaks, where there's no distinction from one unit of meaning from the other. Everything is just sort of smushed into one thing. What a run-on sentence also does, and it's sort of implied in the terminology being used, is that it speeds up the sentence too. So it's as if the Conobot is trying to process you very quickly. It doesn't really have time for all these pleasantries. It's just saying it has an automated, expected thing. This is what humans like. So I will say to you in all 3 common languages, hello, Goeiemorgen, Sawubona, how are you, etc., etc. All these pleasantries, it just wants to get out of the way. So we first notice this, that in the language that the Conobot uses, there's no sense of nuance or sophistication or empathy within how it conveys meaning. It just regurgitates these words mindlessly, meaninglessly. It just wants you to choose between whichever language you're going to use and then process you after that very quickly. There's limited time, things must be processed, time is money, etc. And then we have this quotation here. Music plinks in her ear. Just look up the term music. It's a sort of brand of elevator music that was prevalent or invented in the 50s in America. You'll see, if you watch 1950s American movies or movies set in the 1950s in America, you will know exactly what it is. It's sort of that sort of very gentle, just kind of cheesy, schmaltzy music that plays in elevators as people are waiting from going to floor to floor. It's there just to sort of calm you. It's there to pacify you in some way. And this is how she experiences it as well. This is how Pendy experiences it. Music plinks in her ear, a panpipe version of Stuck in the Middle with You. Haha, very fucking apt, Pendy thinks. She sighs with relief as the song ends, grits her teeth as it begins again. She's about to hang up when the line beeps. Hello, you've reached Home Affairs Weinberg, a heavily accented voice drones. Your call may be recorded for purposes of quality control. This is Vikesh speaking. Please have your assigned DNA number ready. How may I be of assistance to you? So the features that the Conabot uses are evident in the way Vikesh speaks as well. We later find out that Vikesh is actually in Mumbai, not South Africa, but more on that later. The first thing I suppose that is interesting is the use of the elevator music that plays the panpipe version of Stuck in the Middle with You, which seems an odd mix. But that's not really the intention. It's not really sort of artistic integrity that the music is trying to achieve here. It is just trying to pacify you, trying to calm you down. So then it goes on. She reaches the person at the other end of the line, and the other person on the line uses the kind of language that we've seen in the quote above that the Conabots use. Hello, you've reached Home Affairs Weinberg. We later find out in a passage that I'll give to you in a second or two that it's implied that Vikesh is reading off a script. He is based in Mumbai. He has no idea who he's speaking to personally. He can't see their faces. There's no association with South Africa that he has except for the script that he's reading. So he takes a second to figure out where this call is coming from, because he himself is not stationed in a call center in Weinberg. He's stationed in a call center in Mumbai somewhere. Hello, you've reached Home Affairs Weinberg, a heavily accented voice drones. Your call may be recorded for purposes of quality control. This is Vikesh speaking. Please have your assigned DNA number ready. How may I be of assistance to you? So you see that he's also speaking this kind of run-on sentence, and he also uses phrases that are repeated throughout. He asks the same question over and over and makes the same statements over and over. Sorry, you aren't part of the system. We can't process you. Sorry, you aren't part of the system. We can't process you, etc. So he has become like the Conabot. Just a side note, I'm not entirely sure what the Conabot is a reference to. There are a few references to pop culture here and there throughout the story. But Conabot, I'm not quite sure what that implies. Con, you can think of as a lie, I suppose. Con as a prefix also means with. But I'm not quite sure how that fits into the story entirely. The bot part is obviously these are robots, and certainly from short stories like Isaac Asimov's short stories that I mentioned earlier, that use of calling robots bots is evident here. So she is paying homage to the people that came before her, the authors that came before her, sort of recognizing that she's not the first person to interrogate these questions. Other people have done this before. So the con part of the name, I'm not quite sure what that recalls. Vikesh says, your call may be recorded, etc. So he has himself become a kind of Conabot. Somewhere in the text, Pindi refers to people in call centers as drones. And in this passage as well, the narrator alludes to that kind of language, to a heavily accented voice drones. The word there is very specific. First of all, drone, you think of a robot when you think of the word drone. So it is that physical thing that you see in the world, that robot thing. So Vikesh, in some ways, is like a robot too. He's just simply reading off a script. He doesn't really care who you are. He's just doing his job. So within this context of how Home Affairs, perhaps maybe Home Affairs not only in South Africa, but in the global South, countries like South Africa, India, much of Asia and Africa as well, you are processed in a way that strips you of your humanity. But also, the system has encouraged those who work for it to become robots as well. So Vikesh essentially is a robot. And the droning as well, of course, implies that his voice is a kind of drone. So he is both in behavior and how he approaches you, he is like a robot. Also like a robot, he has no compassion. And the creativity part there of the title of the slide sort of comes in now. These robots lack creativity and spontaneity, and what you see is they are either in the first extract saying things to which they are programmed, for which they are programmed. So they're simply, like Vikesh, reading off a script. They're reading off a script, an algorithm that has been placed inside their heads, so to speak, and they're just sort of repeating whatever needs to be said or whatever they're forced to say. Vikesh also lacks this creativity. He doesn't really know how to deal with the situation. All he says is, you are basically a non-person because you don't have an ID number or your DNA number. So this lack of creativity we see determines also a lack of empathy. To be empathetic and to recognize someone's humanity means that you have to be creative in some way. You have to sort of step beyond the confines of your own being and realize that the person that you're confronting also has the same kinds of fears and anxieties and joys and sorrows that you do. So the robots here, and Vikesh as well as an sort of extension of that robot, lacks creativity, and the consequence of that lack of creativity is a lack of compassion, a lack of recognition of humanity in others. So these kinds of features of the text, the repetition and the run-on sentence, serve to inform this world's lack of creativity. Nothing can be made new. Nothing can be sidestepped. Nothing can be nothing is spontaneous. So the reason behind the lack of creativity in this world seems to be because there was a need to curb the excess creativity that had been evident in the world before. In other words, it was a way of curbing corruption. So people would, and corruption is certainly a creative process if you want to be sympathetic or see it in a sort of light kind of way. It requires a manipulation of the system to serve yourself and also your friends, I suppose. But the central aspect of it is that creativity, that ability to manipulate something, to make it do something else, to make it do something other than what it was programmed for. So we see this evident here in the short story, that the programmers and the government tried to strip their department, specifically Home Affairs, of any sign of creativity to curb out corruption. So that is the central intention behind doing this. And the consequence of this lack of creativity is precisely this, that both people that the system serves and the people that serve the system are made to be robots. Here is another exchange between Vikesh and Pendy, and I quite liked the dialogue sections of the short story. I don't think it's a particularly strong short story, but it does give it does have some interesting points to make, and when it does make the points well, it does become quite interesting and quite humorous as well. So here's an exchange between Vikesh and Pendy, where Vikesh is speaking first. Madam, I am trying to help you. Please be remaining calm, or I will have no choice but to disconnect this call. Please clearly state your assigned DNA number, madam. Jesus. Pendy digs in her pockets, pulls out the disc the DNA scanner deposited into her palm, squints as she uses the light from her phone to read it. 89696/12. Thank you, madam. She listens to the skitter-clack of fingers on a keyboard. I am sorry, madam, but there is no record of you being in the system. What do you mean? I was just there. According to my computer, you do not exist, madam. Hello? I'm right here. How can I not exist? Be cool, she tells herself, decides to try a different tactic and see if playing helpless and meek will help. I'm really frightened. Can't you just come and get me? Another pause. I am not at liberty to do that, madam. I am not situated in South Africa. Well, get up. What? What do you mean you're not situated in South Africa? Where are you? Mumbai, madam. I am only at liberty to deal with queries regarding identity status where viable DNA information has been provided. So we see here again an extension of the point that Vikesh is basically a robot. Even though he is human in physical form, mentally, and in terms of how he handles his job, he is a robot. And he treats other people like robots too. He expects from them only a certain limited set of responses, and anything outside of that set of responses is immediately dismissed. He says basically, I don't know how to process this. This is out of my set of skills. This is out of the set of my script, and I can't do any of this. I have to terminate this call. So there are other few features that are interesting here. The first line in particular, Madam, I am trying to help you. Please be remaining calm or I will have no choice but to disconnect this call. There's nothing more fear and anxiety inducing than commanding someone to remain calm. So these are the ironies that you see within the system. Not only is it a system that tries to legitimize or validate your humanity, but at the same time stripping that humanity away. But these ironies sort of perpetuate into all aspects of the system. In this case here, being able to recognize and read other people. He knows that she is being agitated. She is getting agitated and nervous and stressful. So he tries to contain the situation, but only serves to escalate it. And the thing that he's trying to get to, the thing that will satisfy him, the thing that will sort of comply to the requirements of his job is the DNA number. And once she gives it to him, he confirms that it's not on the system. So he says explicitly, you do not exist. According to my computer, you do not exist, madam. But the irony within that sentence there is that he is addressing her, madam, calling her by some kind of title, recognizing that she is a person, recognizing that she does exist, but according to the computer, she doesn't. So he's not able to process that she is a real, actual person. It's only by the information that is supplied by another robot, like himself, the computer, that he is unable to determine that she is actually human, but determines in the end that she does not exist and therefore a non-person. She recognizes this irony. Hello, I'm right here. How can I not exist? So she becomes desperate and she tries to play into what she expects to be his sympathy. She says, she's going to try a different tactic, playing helpless and meek. I'm really frightened. Can't you just come and get me? He pauses. And so there's a suggestion there that perhaps he is humanity sort of kicking in. But then he eventually reverts to, I am not at liberty to do that, madam. I am not situated in South Africa. And that's also a phrase that he repeats, I'm not at liberty to do that. So he doesn't have that kind of freedom to enact those kinds of those actions, whether he wants to or not. He's not really allowed to. The system won't let him. So the disconnection also comes in not just that he is a robot and treating her like a robot, but it is exaggerated in that he is also from a different country. He is from Mumbai. He's from India. He has nothing to do with South Africa. She is from South Africa. She is like 10,000 kilometers away, and she can't get his help because of that geographical distance between them. So this distancing between these two people, one who is working for South Africa but not anywhere near South Africa, one who desperately, and the other person who desperately needs the help of someone within South Africa but can't get a human to interact with to help her with the situation. So this is the other irony within the title. Home affairs, but the irony being that people who are not at home, not within the physical country, are allowed to deal with these kinds of very delicate situations, these very unusual situations, and have to sort of calm people down, empathize with them, try to get their paperwork sorted out. So there's sort of irony on top of irony here, where nothing's really functioning because there is a lack of imagination, lack of creativity behind all of this fuzzy logic. And the way in which he tries to resolve all of this is by going underground. This is, it seems, it's described as a place of a place that was the Home Affairs, no longer is, and Sarah Lotter uses that placement of it being below ground to suggest the different kinds of ways that people try to, ironically, on top of irony, corrupt the system once again, even though the system was designed to be uncorruptible. So we have this extract here from page 26. Where are we going? She says to the guy who sort of runs the subterranean Home Affairs. Where are we going? Into the bowels. The bowels of what? Home Affairs, of course. Of course. You the janitor? He snorts. No, lady. I used to work here, assistant manager, before... His voice trails off. Before your department became so corrupt, you were all replaced by machines, Pendy snaps. We were not all like that, lady. But I bet you were, Pendy thinks. So what's in the bowels, then? You'll see. So they begin to enter the bowels, the underground, the place that Home Affairs used to be. So what is happening above ground is that there was some incident, and we don't know what. All we have is the ellipsis that is sort of a stand-in for the incident, which seems to be like a whole different kind of story that is just left blank. We don't know how the country came to be in this way. What is also interesting about that, when he says before, we are in the before. So Sarah Lott is trying to stress to us a certain historical trajectory on which we are currently present. So we are in the before. The before is now, it's being suggested. And this is what things may look like if we don't curb that ... If we don't curb the kind of things that happened in the before time, whatever the before time is or was. So she's sort of humorously projecting how things may turn out for us, and things don't always look so rosy. So there was this Home Affairs in the before time, and it suggested that on top of those old Home Affairs was built a new Home Affairs that used robots instead of people to process documents, marriage certificates, etc. So this is the new iteration of Home Affairs, but despite that, people use the old Home Affairs to process you accordingly and appropriately in a way that validates your humanity in terms of however humanity is defined by the current government. So there are sort of these extra legal avenues that people use in order to get themselves organized within this place. And of course, as I mentioned before, the irony of that is the corruption that it relies on in order to validate you, in order to recognize you as a human. And we see this in a scene towards the end where the Conobat repeats the line, but with variation. This is a recognized theme. I'm sure you've heard about it before, repetition with variation. So he repeats the phrases, hello, how are you, goeiemorgen, sawubona, etc., etc. But he says that your language entrails, or be, whatever. So he gets the wording wrong, and she's encouraged to respond to it. And when she does, she gets the result that she wants. So this corrupt machine has in fact given her a way of getting the job done. So she gets the job done, but through corrupt means. And the other corruption that is apparent within the system is that it does not treat you as though you are human still. There are people that she looks upon as she's going down the corridor, and when she gets to the place eventually where she is processed by this new machine, this corrupt machine that gives her a DNA number. And the person running this operation is corrupt himself. He doesn't really care about you. He doesn't really care about your humanity. He sees these people as people who are to be taken advantage of. He charges them huge amounts, 500 Rand, for them to be processed. But he knows that, as he suggests or as he implies, if there were other people who were able to do this, they would have done it. I am one person who is taking advantage of the system that would have been in place anyway, even if I weren't here. So it's something that he does out of necessity for his own survival, I suppose. But he is sort of parasitically taking advantage of those who have nothing, those who are desperate, and also, just like the Home Affairs upstairs, does not recognize compassionately your needs, and doesn't really compassionately recognize that you are a human as well. So he does the same kinds of things. He is someone who perpetuates the same kinds of ideologies, that your humanness, the thing that makes you unique, doesn't really matter. I don't care that you are stressed. I don't care that you're traumatized. I don't care that you are crying right now. All I want is your money. And in exchange, I will give you a DNA number. The quote that I have there, the second one: the corridor leads down into a stairwell, equally ill-lit and festering, the putty-coloured walls scrawled with graffiti. Abandon hope, all ye who enter here. I fucked a conobit and got AIDS, and Skynet is now. The graffiti is quite an interesting feature in this. It suggests... So graffiti generally is usually evident in spaces, certain kinds of spaces in which people do not ordinarily feel that they can express themselves freely. So if there aren't enough avenues for self-expression, for getting your point across or being heard, people often resort to graffiti to do this. And this is why graffiti is often sort of iconoclastic or anti-establishment. It fights against hegemonic structures. And we see the same thing kind of here now. We don't know all the details of this world as it is described to us. All we know are these few corridors and these basement areas in the Home Affairs that have been presented to us. But what this just suggests here is that people couldn't express themselves all that freely above ground. They couldn't do that in the normal Home Affairs because they would be targeted as creating a disruption and then be put in the basement. A hole in the floor would open up and they'd be swallowed into the Home Affairs and be sort of disciplined. So all people have is to express themselves in this subterranean area where official people, government officials won't have access to, government officials won't really know who is behind all this graffiti. So they feel comfortable expressing themselves here in these very confined, very hidden places. And the message within the graffiti also sort of reflects those sentiments, that people are unhappy with what's happening above ground in the normal Home Affairs, how government has begun to work. So we have abandon hope, all who enter here. So people are clearly expressing their dismay, their despair at the situation that they find themselves in. I fucked a conobit and got AIDS. I suppose is some gruesome, twisted humor there. And then Skynet is now. Skynet is a company. It's actually a real company that exists now, but it was, I think, first a company that appeared in the Terminator series. So the Terminator series began in the 80s. The first one appeared in the 80s, I think in around 85 or so. Terminator 2 came out in 1992, I think, and then 3 and 4 followed after that, like 10 or 15 years after that. And like the text that I mentioned before, 2001: A Space Odyssey, I, Robot, and Eagle Eye, Terminator, and its sequels largely portray this company Skynet that is yet another example of an algorithm, a robot, a piece of machinery that is trying to take over the world and trying to obliterate humans because humans don't really know what's good for them. So again, these are the influences that Sarah Lotz is identifying within her short story, showing that these thoughts have become prevalent within the genre of science fiction. And I'm certainly not the first person to suggest these thoughts. It's just that I am now putting these very old arguments into a African context. And then we have the final line of the short story, the unforgivably cliche line, the worst sentence in the story: the more things change, the more they stay the same. It's a very bad line, only because it is cliched and it is the final sentence of the short story, and this is sort of a culmination of her thesis statement, a culmination of her argument for what this world means, how we can read the world. So, despite its terrible, terrible clichédness, it does suggest, or it is interesting if you sort of read behind it to see what Sarah Lotz is trying to show about robots, and how robots are used as instantiations or replacements for humans, and how, as a consequence, some humans become robots as well. So the more things change, the more they stay the same. That line there, I think, is for us, present-day readers of this short story. The short story takes place within the future, and I think anytime you read it, it will always take place in the future. It's suggested that it's taking place in the future by the first quotation on this page where the man that Pendy speaks to says, before. So what we have is a world that is not ours, one that is beyond ours, temporally speaking. So it's a line that stands there for our benefit and our amusement. What she is doing is suggesting that nothing fundamentally has changed. It has probably just become exaggerated. In our context, with the corruption of Home Affairs, and as a result of that, with the lack of resources that Home Affairs has, with forms getting lost, with people getting lost, with other kind of essential documents getting lost, there is the frustration that comes with that your humanity is not really recognized, and the state doesn't recognize you as a person. But within the context of the short story, that continues, but with the added frustration of not being able to interact with people who might have, where there might be a chance for someone to attend to your situation with compassion and empathy. So she's suggesting that this world really is, in some ways, similar to the world we live in now, just with a different kind of aesthetic to it, just with different kinds of rules, different kinds of actors, performing the same kinds of roles, reading from the same script. So this, I think, is the point that she's trying to make here, that nothing really has changed from our current situation. But she does have that added warning that if we have the robots taking over, things could get worse. So it may be the same, but it's just worse or more of the same, exaggeratedly the same. So this is the kind of message that she leaves us off with. I don't think it's the central argument in her short story. I think what a central argument is mainly is that we have to sort of be careful about how we use technology and how we interact with robots, and even more specifically than that, how we should be careful about having robots replace humans or certain aspects of human behavior, because programming something as very nuanced and very sophisticated and very subtle as empathy and compassion is perhaps not even impossible, just extremely difficult to get right. Because as a consequence of that, when things go wrong, things go really, really wrong. You get swallowed up into the basement of a home affairs, which is not a place anyone would want to be, I don't think. So I will leave the lecture there as the final point, and I will see you all again for the next short story. Goodbye.